She had been given 1 hour to become someone else. If you are the kind of soul who believes that love can find you even in the darkest of corners, even when you have been discarded, overlooked, and sent in place of someone more beautiful, then this story was written for you. Before we begin, if stories like this one move you, please subscribe to this channel. Every subscription tells us you want more tales of love that refuses to be extinguished, and we pour our whole hearts into bringing them to you. Now, let us step into Alara's world. On the night everything changed. The candle on Alara Ashwood's dressing table had burned down to a trembling stub by the time her father's footsteps stopped outside her door. She knew those footsteps. She had spent 23 years learning their rhythms. The confident stride when business was good, the heavy drag when it was not, and this particular measured pace, the one that meant he was about to ask something she would not want to give. He did not knock. He never knocked on her door. "You will be ready by dawn," he said, stepping into the small room that had always been hers, the one at the back of the house where the morning light arrived last. He did not look at her directly. Edmund Ashwood had a talent for addressing the space just beside a person, as though acknowledging them fully might cost him something. The carriage comes at first light. Alara set down the book she had been reading, a worn volume of botanical illustrations she had borrowed from the local lending library and never quite returned. "The carriage," she repeated. "To Ravensmoor." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Alara felt the ripples move through her chest. Ravensmoor. Everyone in the county knew the name, the way everyone knows the name of a storm that has already done its damage. The Duke of Ravensmoor, Lord Caelan Ravensmoor, was spoken of in the way that people speak of things they do not fully understand but have decided to fear. He was the last of an ancient northern line, master of a castle that sat at the edge of the coastal cliffs, like a man who had not yet decided whether to step back from the precipice. He was said to be cold, remote, scarred from a riding accident that had also taken something less visible than skin. His first wife had died 3 years prior under circumstances that no one discussed plainly, but everyone discussed endlessly in lowered voices over tea. He was, by every account Alara had ever gathered, a man devoid of softness. He was also, by the arrangement her father had spent the better part of a year engineering, supposed to be her sister's husband. "Cecily," Alara said carefully. "The Duke is to marry Cecily." Her father's jaw tightened. "Cecily is gone." The words were simple. The story behind them was not. Alara had known, in the way that younger sisters often know things they are not told, that something had shifted in the house over the past fortnight. Cecily had been quieter than usual. Cecily, who was never quiet, who moved through every room like a song being played at full volume, beautiful and bright and aware of both. Cecily, who had wept once behind a closed door and gone silent when Alara asked if she was well. "Gone," Alara said. "What does that mean, gone?" "She has eloped." The word came out clipped and bitter, like something her father had bitten through. "With a younger Harcastle boy. They left 3 days ago. I have only just confirmed it." Alara was quiet for a moment. Somewhere beneath the shock, beneath the cold creep of dread beginning to move up her spine, she felt something small and shameful that she would never have admitted aloud. Relief for Cecily. Because she had heard Cecily weeping. Because she knew what it meant to be arranged and sold by a father who counted daughters the way other men counted livestock. "Then the arrangement is broken," Alara said. "The Duke will need to be informed." "The Duke," her father said, "has already paid." Silence. "The contracts are signed. The settlement has been received. The union is agreed upon by 2 noble houses and recorded in the county register." Edmund Ashwood finally looked at his daughter, truly looked at her, with the flat calculation she had always known lived behind his eyes. "You will go in her place. I am not Cecily. You are an Ashwood daughter. The contract names an Ashwood daughter." He said it as though it were simple, as though she were interchangeable, as though she had not spent her entire life understanding, on some cellular level, that in this house she was precisely that interchangeable, the lesser version, the one kept in reserve. "He will know," Alara said. "The moment he sees me, he will know I am not who he was promised. Cecily and I look nothing alike." Then you will manage that conversation when it comes." Her father turned toward the door, the matter apparently settled in his mind. 1 hour. Pack only what you can carry, without assistance. I will not be waking the maids at this hour. Father. Her voice was low, but something in it made him stop. I am asking you to hear me. I am not a replacement. I am a person. I have a life here such as it is, my books, my garden, the parish work I do on Thursdays. You have nothing that cannot be left. He said it without cruelty, which was somehow worse than cruelty would have been. He said it as simple fact. The Duke has paid a great deal of money. Our debts are cleared. Your sister has chosen her own path and left this family to answer for it. You will go. He left without closing the door behind him. Alara sat for a long time in the guttering candlelight. The botanical illustrations lay open on her lap, a page of wild roses rendered in careful ink, and she stared at them without seeing them. She was not beautiful in the way that Cecily was beautiful, the kind of beauty that made rooms rearrange themselves, that made men trip over their own courtesy. Alara was quieter in appearance as in habit, brown-haired, gray-eyed, with the kind of face that rewarded patience but rarely demanded it. She had always known her value in her father's ledger. She had made peace with it long ago, or had believed she had. The carriage would come at dawn. She would ride north to a castle she had never seen, to stand before a man she had never met, and tell him, somehow, in some way she had not yet determined, that the woman he had contracted to marry had run away with someone else, and that what he had received instead was Alara, plain, unimportant, unremarkable Alara, who grew herbs in a small garden and read borrowed books, and had never once been the person anyone truly wanted. She rose from her chair. She packed her bag. She packed the botanical book, because it was not hers to keep, but she needed something that felt like herself, something that had nothing to do with what her father needed, or what a duke had paid for, or what her sister had escaped. At dawn, when the carriage rolled up the muddy lane, and the driver looked down at her with mild, incurious eyes, Alara Ashwood picked up her bag, squared her shoulders in the gray morning air, and climbed in. She had been given 1 hour to become someone else. She had spent it, instead, deciding to remain entirely herself. The carriage rolled north, and the world she had known fell away behind her like a page turned in someone else's story. And whatever came next, cold duke, forbidding castle, political ruin, or something she had not yet the imagination to foresee, she would meet it as Alara. It was, she decided, the only weapon she had. It would have to be enough. The road to Ravensmoor did not ease a person in gently. It began its transformation somewhere north of the last market town, the moment the carriage turned off the main post road and onto a narrower track that wound through increasingly austere landscape. The hedgerows gave way to open moorland, vast and gray gold and indifferent, stretching in every direction like a shrug. The sky lowered. The light, which had been thin to begin with, thinned further, as though the sun thought better of following this far north and had quietly withdrawn its investment. Alara watched it all through the carriage window with the careful attention she gave to most things, not with dread, exactly, but with the particular alertness of someone who understands that their surroundings are about to matter very much. She had brought the botanical book. She had also brought a small journal, a change of clothes, a wool shawl her mother had left her, and very little else. Everything that had constituted her life until yesterday fit into a single bag, which she supposed said something, though she was not yet sure what. The driver had told her the journey would take the better part of a day. He had not been wrong. By the time the horses slowed and Alara heard the driver call something low and indistinct to his animals, the light outside had shifted from gray to the particular dim amber of a northern afternoon approaching its end. She leaned toward the window, and there it was. Ravensmoor Castle did not announce itself the way the grand houses of the south announce themselves, with sweeping drives and manicured parkland and the architectural equivalent of a man clearing his throat to ensure you noticed him. Ravensmoor simply appeared, as though it had always been there and had simply been waiting for you to be worthy of seeing it. It sat at the top of a cliff-edged headland, the North Sea churning gray and vast behind it, and it was built in the old way, dark stone, thick-walled, with towers that had been designed not for elegance, but for endurance. It looked like something that had survived things. Multiple things. Over a very long period of time. The fog was moving in from the sea. Even as Alara watched, it rolled across the headland in slow, deliberate tendrils, curling around the base of the outer walls like something proprietary. Like it belonged there. Like the castle and the fog had long ago reached an arrangement. The carriage passed through iron gates that opened without anyone visibly opening them. She glimpsed a gatehouse, a figure stepping back into shadow. And then they were climbing the last rise, the horses laboring slightly, the wheels grinding against old stone, and then the carriage stopped. Alara did not wait for assistance. She opened the door herself, stepped down onto the forecourt, and stood in the sea-cold air of Ravensmoor. The castle was larger up close than it had appeared from a road, which she had not expected. Most impressive things diminish as you approach them. This one grew. The main entrance was a pair of heavy oak doors banded in iron, set into a stone arch carved with a Ravensmoor crest, a raven in flight above a stormy sea. The stonework around the arch was old enough that the edges had softened, worn smooth by centuries of salt wind. On either side of the doors stood 2 footmen in dark livery, utterly still, watching her with a careful blankness of staff well trained in the art of revealing nothing. Alara lifted her bag and walked toward the doors. They opened before she reached them. The woman who emerged was perhaps 60, small and compact, with white hair pulled back in a severe knot and eyes the color of a morning that had not yet decided whether to be kind. She wore the dress and keys of a housekeeper, and she assessed Alara in approximately 3 seconds with an efficiency that suggested she had been assessing people at this threshold for decades and had developed strong opinions about what she found. "Miss Ashwood," the woman said. Not a question. "Yes," Alara said. "I am Mrs. Doran. I manage the household." A brief pause. "We expected Miss Cecily Ashwood." There it was. The first of what Alara suspected would be many such moments. That particular variety of statement that is not quite a question, but contains one folded inside it, waiting to be extracted. Alara had rehearsed this in the carriage for approximately 6 hours. She had not arrived at a satisfying answer, so she had settled on honesty abbreviated. "There was a change in circumstance," she said. "I am Alara Ashwood. I am here in my sister's place." Mrs. Doran looked at her for a long moment. Whatever conclusion the housekeeper reached, she kept it behind those morning-colored eyes. "His Grace has been informed of your arrival," she said at last. "He will receive you in the study. Come." The road to Ravensmoor did not ease a person in gently. It began its transformation somewhere north of the last market town, the moment the carriage turned off the main post road and onto a narrower track that wound through increasingly austere landscape. The hedgerows gave way to open moorland, vast and gray-gold and indifferent, stretching in every direction like a shrug. The sky lowered. The light, which had been thin to begin with, thinned further, as though the sun thought better of following this far north and had quietly withdrawn its investment. Alara watched it all through the carriage window with the careful attention she gave to most things, not with dread, exactly, but with the particular alertness of someone who understands that their surroundings are about to matter very much. She had brought the botanical book. She had also brought a small journal, a change of clothes, a wool shawl her mother had left her, and very little else. Everything that had constituted her life until yesterday fit into a single bag, which she supposed said something, though she was not yet sure what. The driver had told her the journey would take the better part of a day. He had not been wrong. By the time the horses slowed and Alara heard the driver call something low and indistinct to his animals, the light outside had shifted from gray to the particular dim amber of a northern afternoon approaching its end. She leaned toward the window, and there it was. Ravensmoor Castle did not announce itself the way the grand houses of the south announce themselves, with sweeping drives and manicured parkland and the architectural equivalent of a man clearing his throat to ensure you noticed him. Ravensmoor simply appeared, as though it had always been there and had simply been waiting for you to be worthy of seeing it. It sat at the top of a cliff-edged headland, the North Sea churning gray and vast behind it, and it was built in the old way, dark stone, thick-walled, with towers that had been designed not for elegance, but for endurance. It looked like something that had survived things. Multiple things. Over a very long period of time. The fog was moving in from the sea. Even as Alara watched, it rolled across the headland in slow, deliberate tendrils, curling around the base of the outer walls like something proprietary. Like it belonged there. Like the castle and the fog had long ago reached an arrangement. The carriage passed through iron gates that opened without anyone visibly opening them. She glimpsed a gatehouse, a figure stepping back into shadow. And then they were climbing the last rise, the horses laboring slightly, the wheels grinding against old stone, and then the carriage stopped. Alara did not wait for assistance. She opened the door herself, stepped down onto the forecourt, and stood in the sea-cold air of Ravensmoor. The castle was larger up close than it had appeared from a road, which she had not expected. Most impressive things diminish as you approach them. This one grew. The main entrance was a pair of heavy oak doors banded in iron, set into a stone arch carved with a Ravensmoor crest, a raven in flight above a stormy sea. The stonework around the arch was old enough that the edges had softened, worn smooth by centuries of salt wind. On either side of the doors stood 2 footmen in dark livery, utterly still, watching her with a careful blankness of staff well trained in the art of revealing nothing. Alara lifted her bag and walked toward the doors. They opened before she reached them. The woman who emerged was perhaps 60, small and compact, with white hair pulled back in a severe knot and eyes the color of a morning that had not yet decided whether to be kind. She wore the dress and keys of a housekeeper, and she assessed Alara in approximately 3 seconds with an efficiency that suggested she had been assessing people at this threshold for decades and had developed strong opinions about what she found. "Miss Ashwood," the woman said. Not a question. "Yes," Alara said. "I am Mrs. Doran. I manage the household." A brief pause. "We expected Miss Cecily Ashwood." There it was. The first of what Alara suspected would be many such moments. That particular variety of statement that is not quite a question, but contains one folded inside it, waiting to be extracted. Alara had rehearsed this in the carriage for approximately 6 hours. She had not arrived at a satisfying answer, so she had settled on honesty abbreviated. "There was a change in circumstance," she said. "I am Alara Ashwood. I am here in my sister's place." Mrs. Doran looked at her for a long moment. Whatever conclusion the housekeeper reached, she kept it behind those morning-colored eyes. "His Grace has been informed of your arrival," she said at last. "He will receive you in the study. Come." The Duke did not sit while she spoke. He stood behind his desk with the stillness of a man long practiced in using silence as leverage, and he listened, truly listened, she noted, without interrupting. Without the dismissive half-attention most men of his station bestowed upon women delivering inconvenient information. His hands rested flat on the surface of the desk. His expression did not change. And when Alara finished her account, plain, unembellished, stripped of both self-pity and unnecessary apology, the quiet that followed was the particular kind that is weight to it. She had told him everything relevant. Cecily's elopement, her father's debts, cleared by the Duke's settlement, the contract naming an Ashwood daughter, without the specificity of a given name, her own absence of choice in the matter. She had not told him about the hour she had spent sitting in the candlelight, deciding to remain herself, because that felt private in a way the rest of it did not. The fire crackled. The wind continued its conversation with the outer walls. "Your father," the Duke said at last, "sent you here without notifying me of the substitution." "Yes. He believed the contract's wording would protect him from consequence. I believe he hoped the distance between here and our county would make consequence impractical." Something shifted in the Duke's jaw, a tightening, quickly controlled. "And you? Did you come willingly?" It was the first question that felt personal rather than procedural, and it surprised her, not the question itself, but the quality of attention behind it, as though the answer mattered to him, as though he was sorting people carefully into categories she could not yet see. "I came," Alara said, "because I had no meaningful alternative." Whether that constitutes willingness, I leave to your interpretation." He looked at her for a moment. Then he moved from behind the desk, not toward her, but to the window, where the fog had now fully arrived and pressed itself against the glass like a curious thing. He stood with his back partially to her, looking out at nothing visible. "I will be direct with you, Miss Ashwood," he said. "I am not a man who performs courtship. The arrangement I entered with your family was precisely that, an arrangement. Political in nature, practical in structure. I required a wife of acceptable lineage to satisfy certain terms of my estate's entailment. Your family required financial relief. It was a transaction, and I treated it as one." He paused. "I had not expected warmth from the arrangement, nor had I intended to offer it." "I see," Alara said. "I am telling you this," he continued, "because I will not have misunderstanding take root in this house. There is no room in my life for the theater of romantic expectation. I do not pretend to emotions I do not possess, and I do not reward those who pretend to them in my presence." He turned from the window then, and looked at her with that direct, sea-gray regard. "If you remain here, if the arrangement proceeds, you will be treated with respect and provided with every material comfort this estate can offer. You will manage the household alongside Mrs. Doran. You will appear beside me at such public functions as are necessary, and you will have the freedom of the castle and grounds without restriction, save one." Alara waited. "The third floor," he said. "The eastern corridor. You will not go there." He said it simply, without drama, in the same tone he had used to describe household management. But something in the words sat differently than the rest, denser, somehow, heavier, as though they had been carried a long way before being set down. "Very well," Alara said. He studied her. "You agree, without question. You have given me a clear instruction with a clear boundary. I am not in the habit of requiring reasons for every rule before I respect it." She met his gaze. "Though I reserve the right to ask questions about other things, such as whether you intend to write to my father, and what you intend to say." The Duke was quiet for a moment. "I intend to write to your father," he said. "What I say will depend on what I decide about the arrangement. You are considering dissolving it. I am considering my options." Alara nodded slowly. She had expected this. She had sat in that carriage for the better part of a day, thinking of little else, turning the possibilities over the way you turn a stone to see what lies beneath it. Dissolution was logical. She was not what he had contracted for. He owed her nothing, nothing except perhaps a modicum of human decency, which he assessed him, so far, as capable of providing. And yet, she thought of her father's house. The small room at the back where the morning light came last. The botanical book she had not returned. The life that her father had described, with devastating accuracy, as nothing that cannot be left. If she went back, nothing would have changed. She would be returned like an unsatisfactory purchase, and she would resume the shapeless existence of an unmarried daughter in a household that had never quite known what to do with her, and she would grow quietly smaller until she disappeared. "May I say something?" she said. "That is not a negotiation and not a plea, but simply an observation." The Duke made a slight gesture with one hand. "Permission. You contracted for a wife of acceptable lineage to satisfy the terms of your entailment," she said. "I am of acceptable lineage. I am, if anything, better educated than my sister. I say this not as vanity, but as fact, because it may be relevant to the household management you described. I am not prone to complaint, to theatrics, or to demands of emotional reciprocity from people unwilling to offer it." She paused. "I also have no illusions about what this marriage would be, which means I will not spend it grieving for what it is not. If you are looking for a woman who will make sensible, practical use of an arrangement and ask nothing from it but honesty and respect, I am, in fact, more suited to that than Cecily would have been." Silence. The Duke stood in the firelight and the fog-muted dark of the window behind him, and he looked at her with an expression she could not decode, not cold precisely, but very carefully neutral, like a door that was neither open nor closed. "You are candid," he said at last. "I find it saves time." He almost did something with the corner of his mouth. It was so brief, she might have imagined it. "Mrs. Doran will show you to your rooms," he said. "You will dine alone this evening. I will give you my decision in the morning." It was a dismissal. A civil one, which she supposed was something. Ilara picked up her bag. She walked to the door and then stopped, because something made her stop. Some instinct she did not yet fully understand, but had learned, over 23 years of careful observation, to trust. "Your Grace," she said, without turning around. A pause. "Miss Ashwood, whatever you decide tomorrow, I want you to know that I am not afraid of this house." She did glance back then, briefly, over her shoulder. "I thought that might matter to you, for reasons I cannot yet name." She did not wait for his response. She went out into the corridor where Mrs. Doran was waiting, and she followed the housekeeper up through the quiet stone passages of Ravensmoor Castle, and she did not let the tremble in her hands become visible until she was entirely alone. It had cost her something, that composure, but she had kept it. And, in the morning, when his decision came, she would keep it again, whatever it was. The decision came at breakfast, delivered not by the Duke himself, but by Mrs. Doran, who set a plate of toast and soft-boiled eggs before Ilara in the small morning room and said, without preamble, "His Grace has decided the arrangement will proceed," and then poured the tea, and left before Ilara could arrange her face into something appropriately composed. She sat for a moment with the steam rising from the cup and the gray morning light coming through the east-facing window, and she breathed. "Proceed." It was not a warm word. It was not a word that carried within it any promise of happiness or companionship or the small human comforts she had quietly, privately hoped might be possible. But it was not dissolution. It was not the carriage recalled and the humiliating return to her father's house and the small room where the light came last. It was forward, which was the only direction Ilara had ever known how to move in, and she would take it. She ate her breakfast. She met Mrs. Doran in the entrance hall at 9, as instructed, for the tour of the household. The castle, seen in the practical daylight of a working morning, revealed itself in layers. There was the public face of it, the entrance hall, the dining room, the drawing rooms on the ground floor, all maintained with the same disciplined, joyless precision she had noted the night before. Clean, ordered, functional, and stripped of anything that might be described as personal. No flowers, though she could see from the walled garden visible through the drawing room windows that flowers were available. No books left open on tables, no half-finished projects, no evidence of the small habitual clutter that accumulates wherever people actually live. It was a house that had been, in some essential way, suspended. Then there was the working face, the kitchens, the larder, the linen rooms, the servants' quarters. Here things were different. Here there was noise and warmth and the particular ordered chaos of a household staff, doing what household staffs do. And the people Ilara met in these rooms were cautious, but not unkind. Cook was a broad, red-faced woman named Agnes, who assessed Ilara with frank curiosity and offered her a piece of shortbread with the air of someone extending a conditional peace treaty. Two parlor maids named Bess and Joan watched her from doorways with the undisguised interest of people whose daily lives had just become considerably more interesting. It was Joan, the younger of the two, perhaps 16, with a gap between her front teeth and the unguarded face of someone who had not yet learned to be careful, who said it. They were in the linen corridor on the second floor, Ilara making notes in her small journal about household inventory as Mrs. Doran itemized counts, when Joan appeared with an armful of freshly pressed tablecloths and stopped short at the sight of the woman standing where no woman had stood in 3 years. "Oh," Joan said. And then, because 16-year-olds with unguarded faces cannot always prevent what comes next, "You're nothing like her." "Joan." Mrs. Doran's voice was a door closing. "Sorry, Mrs. Doran." Joan ducked her head and moved past them. But she glanced back once at Ilara, not unkindly, but with something in her eyes that was more complicated than simple curiosity. Mrs. Doran did not acknowledge the exchange. She continued her inventory count with perfect composure. Ilara wrote nothing in her journal for a moment. Her, the first Duchess, the woman who had been here before her, in these corridors, in these rooms, whose absence had hollowed the place out and left it in this peculiar state of preserved suspension. Ilara had known, in the abstract, that the Duke was a widower. Everyone knew. But knowing a thing in the abstract, and standing in the linen corridor, feeling the specific shape of that absence, were different experiences entirely. "Mrs. Doran," she said carefully. "How long were they married?" "The Duke and his first wife." 2 years, Mrs. Doran said. "Was she?" Ilara paused, choosing her words with the precision of someone crossing a floor they are not certain will hold them. "Was she happy here?" Mrs. Doran set down her inventory ledger. She looked at Ilara with those morning-colored eyes, and for a moment the housekeeper's careful professional composure thinned slightly. The way ice thins in early spring, still present, but changed. "That," she said, "is not a question I am able to answer. And I would ask you, Miss Ashwood, not to ask it of the staff." A pause. "For their sake as much as for yours." Ilara nodded. She asked nothing further. But the curiosity, once wakened, did not sleep. She began to notice things, because noticing things was the habit of a lifetime, and she could no more stop it than she could stop breathing. She noticed the bare rectangles on the wallpaper, one in the dining room, 2 in the corridor near the main staircase, 1 in the drawing room above the fireplace, where paintings had been removed. She noticed that the removed paintings had left ghosts of themselves in the faded paper, and that based on the dimensions of those ghosts, they had been portraits. Not landscapes, not hunting scenes. Portraits, the size that households commission when they wish to commemorate a person. She noticed that there was a portrait still hanging in the entrance hall, the Duke himself, younger, painted in the formal manner of his rank, but that it hung alone on a wall that had clearly been designed to hold 2. She noticed, on her second evening in the castle, a door. She had been walking the second-floor corridor after dinner, orienting herself to the geography of the place the way she oriented herself to everything, by patient, repeated traversal, when she reached the staircase at the northern end that led upward to the 3rd floor. She had not forgotten the Duke's instruction. She stood at the bottom of those stairs and looked up into the dim landing above, and she did not climb them. But she could see, from where she stood, that the corridor at the top was not dark in the way of disuse. A thin thread of light moved under one of the doors up there. Candlelight or firelight. Someone was in that corridor. She stood for a moment longer than she should have. Then she turned and went back to her rooms. On the 3rd day, she found the portrait. It was not on the wall. It was in a small anteroom off the library, a room used, apparently, for the storage of things that did not currently have a place, and it was facing the wall, turned around deliberately, so that what it depicted was pressed against the plaster, and only the plain wooden backing of the frame was visible to anyone entering the room. It was a large portrait, and it had been turned with sufficient care that the frame was not damaged. Someone had not simply removed it in anger. Someone had taken care with the removal, which was somehow worse. Ilara stood before the backwards portrait for a long time. She did not turn it around. She understood, on some instinct she trusted, that turning it around would be a transgression, not because she had been told so, but because the care with which it had been reversed told her that whatever was on the other side of that canvas belonged to a grief too private for her uninvited eyes. She left the anteroom and went to the library instead, where she had begun to spend her evenings, because the library was the one room in Ravensmoor Castle that felt genuinely inhabited. The books were not decorative. They were red, their spines cracked, their pages marked with slips of paper and occasional marginal annotations in a hand she was beginning to recognize. Precise. Economical. The hand of someone who thought carefully before committing anything to paper. She chose a book and settled in the chair nearest the fire and read until the candles burned low. She was almost at the door when she saw the inscription. It was on the inside cover of the book she had been reading, A Natural History of Coastal Flora, which she had selected because the subject interested her, and which she had not examined closely before opening. The inscription was short. 3 lines, in a different hand from the marginal notes, a looser hand, more fluid, almost hurried, as though written quickly or with strong feeling. For Kaelin, so you will know the names of the things growing outside your window. You never look at them. You should. He. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she closed the book gently and placed it back on the shelf exactly where she had found it. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the large, unfamiliar bed in the room that Mrs. Doran had prepared for her and listened to the sea working against the cliffs below. And she thought about a woman who had written an inscription in a book about coastal flora and left it for a man who never looked out his own windows. A woman who had hoped, apparently, that a book might encourage him to see what was growing in his own garden. A woman whose portrait faced the wall. A woman whose rooms were locked. A woman whose name, Elara realized, she had not yet heard spoken aloud by a single person in this house. She thought about grief that turns a portrait to face the wall instead of removing it entirely. The difference between those two acts was significant, she felt. Removal was erasure. Turning was something else. Something that could not quite let go. The sea continued below. The wind moved through the eaves. Somewhere on the third floor, she imagined, the thread of candlelight still moved under a door. She closed her eyes. There were secrets in these walls, layered like the geology of the cliffs outside, ancient and compressed and shaped by forces that had been working on them for a long time. She was a newcomer here. She had no claim on those secrets. But she was, it seemed, going to stay. And things that are buried have a way, eventually, of being found. The storm arrived on a Thursday. Elara knew it was coming before it came. She had grown up near enough to open country to read whether the way some people read faces, in the quality of the light and the particular restlessness of birds, and the way the air pressure changes in your ears and behind your eyes. By mid-morning the sky above the headland had turned the color of a bruise healing badly. And by early afternoon, the first serious gusts were coming off the sea with a kind of intent that suggested they had been building for a long time and had finally decided to make their point. Mrs. Doran secured the kitchen shutters. Agnes brought in the herb pots from the kitchen garden. The two parlor maids moved through the castle closing windows with the practiced efficiency of a household that had weathered northern storms before and held no illusions about the sea's opinion of preparation. Elara had spent the morning in the walled garden, which had become, in the 10 days since her arrival, the place she went when she needed to think without the feeling of stone walls absorbing her thoughts. The garden was in a state of handsome neglect. The bones of it were beautiful, the old plantings still present and still growing with the stubborn persistence of things that have been left alone long enough to develop their own intentions, but untended in recent years, unpruned, unchanneled. It was the kind of garden that needed someone to pay it attention without imposing too much order, and Elara had been paying it careful, respectful attention every morning since she arrived. She had not asked permission to do this. She had simply done it, which she suspected was either the right instinct or a considerable overreach, and she had not yet been told which. The storm chased her indoors shortly after 2. She went to the library, because the library was where she always went, and she had a fire lit and a book open and a cup of tea cooling beside her when she heard the door. She had not, in 10 days at Ravensmoor, seen the Duke enter the library. She had seen him at dinner. They dined together now, by a tacit arrangement that had established itself without either of them formally proposing it, and she had seen him crossing the entrance hall on his way to or from the estate business that consumed the majority of his hours. Once she had seen him in the stable yard from the garden wall, speaking to his head groom, and she had noted that he touched the nose of a gray mare with a gentleness that he did not appear to apply to anything else. But he had not come to the library. Until now. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her, and something brief and unreadable crossed his face. Then he came in. He did not speak. He went directly to the far wall of shelves, pulled a volume with the ease of long familiarity, and settled into the chair on the opposite side of the fireplace. The chair that Elara had not used because it was clearly the chair that was used, worn at the armrests in the specific way of a chair that has held the same person for many years. She said nothing. He said nothing. Outside, the storm made its presence known with increasing emphasis. They read in silence for perhaps 40 minutes, which Elara found not unpleasant. She was not a person who required sound to fill space. She had spent enough of her life in rooms where she was present, but unacknowledged, to have developed a comfortable relationship with quiet. It was the Duke who broke it. "Coastal flora," he said. She looked up. He was looking at the spine of her book. She had gone back to the natural history, had taken it from the shelf again deliberately, telling herself it was simply because the subject interested her, and not because of the inscription she had read and could not stop thinking about. "Yes," she said. "You have an interest in botany." "I do. I kept a garden at home. Nothing as ambitious as what is growing in your walled garden, but it was mine." She paused. "I hope you do not object to my spending time in the garden here." "I should have asked." "I do not object." He looked at the fire for a moment. "It has not been tended properly in some years." "No," she agreed, "though it is remarkably resilient. Good bones." Something shifted in his expression at those words, a slight tension, quickly smoothed. She filed it away, without drawing attention to it. "You make notes," he said. "In the mornings. I have seen you from the study window. You carry a journal." She had not known he watched from the study window. She absorbed this information carefully. "I record what I find. What is growing, what condition it is in, what it might need. It helps me think." "What conclusions have you reached?" It was not quite a question. He had a way of delivering questions in the syntax of statements, as though the interrogative represented a vulnerability he was not willing to fully commit to. She was learning to hear the question inside the statement. That whoever designed the original garden had genuine knowledge and genuine love for the work, she said. The planting choices are not fashionable ones. They are practical and considered plants that would survive the salt wind, that would provide interest across seasons, that would attract the kind of insects that keep a garden healthy. Someone chose them very carefully. She paused. And that the garden has been lonely, which is a sentimental observation and not a botanical one, but there it is. The Duke was quiet for a moment. "My mother designed it," he said, "when she first came to Ravensmoor as a bride. She said the garden was the first thing she changed, because a garden tells you more about a house than the house itself does." It was more, Elara realized, than he had volunteered about himself or his history in all the dinners they had shared. She received it quietly, without making an event of it. She had good instincts, Elara said. He nodded once, and returned to his book. The storm intensified outside. Rain arrived with the decisive force of something that had been threatening all day and had finally run out of patience, and the windows rattled in their frames, and the fire leaned sideways in the grate as the wind found its way through some gap in the chimney stack. The library felt, in contrast to all of that, very enclosed, very present. Two people in two chairs with a fire between them, and a storm making the outside world irrelevant. "May I ask you something?" Elara said, some time later. He looked up from his book. "The annotations in the margins," she said, "throughout the library. Are they yours?" A pause. "Yes. I notice them because I annotate too. My own books." She turned a page. "I find it interesting that you write questions more often than conclusions. Most people who annotate write conclusions." The silence that followed was long enough that she wondered if she had overstepped. She was developing a working theory about the Duke of Ravensmoor, that he could tolerate observation, but was less comfortable with the moment of being seen. They were different experiences, and he appeared to understand the difference. "Questions are more honest," he said at last. "A conclusion forecloses. A question stays open." She looked up at him. He was looking at the fire, not at her, which perhaps made it easier to say. "I think that is one of the more interesting things I have heard anyone say," she said. He did not respond. But there was, she noticed, a slight adjustment in his posture, barely perceptible, the kind of shift that happens in a person's body when something reaches them that they were not entirely expecting. They returned to their books. An hour later, Agnes sent up a tray with soup and bread, apparently having assessed the situation from the kitchen with the pragmatic accuracy of someone who had worked in this house long enough to understand when dinner arrangements required flexibility. They ate from the tray by the fire without discussing the informality of it, which was itself a kind of ease. Elara was gathering her things to return to her rooms when a crash of thunder directly overhead made the candles gutter, and the fire collapse into itself. And she startled, involuntarily, a small sharp intake of breath, her hand gripping the book she was holding. In the sudden dim, she heard the Duke say, quietly and without mockery, "The acoustics in this room amplify it. The first time is always worse than the second." She looked at him in the low light. He was looking at her with an expression she had not yet seen on his face, not warm, exactly, but present, attentive, as though he had said the thing because he thought it might help, and had said it without calculating whether he should. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. The candles steadied. The fire rebuilt itself. The storm continued without apology. They did not speak again before she left. But walking back through the corridors to her rooms, her book under her arm and the warmth of the library fire still in her skin, Elara found herself thinking of questions that stay open, and of a man whose margins were full of them, and of the particular quality of that last hour, unhurried, unperformed, two people simply being in the same place without requiring anything of each other. She had not expected it. She could not yet name it, but she carried it carefully back to her room, the way you carry something fragile in the dark, making sure not to spill it. Lord Philip Ashmore arrived on a Tuesday unannounced, in a carriage bearing the crest of a family that had been intertwined with the Ravensmore estate through 3 generations of business and mutual obligation. He was 50, broad-shouldered, with the florid confidence of a man accustomed to being received well, and the sharp eyes of one who had made a considerable fortune by noticing things other people preferred he did not. Elara did not know he was coming. She was in the walled garden when his carriage came through the gates, close enough to hear the wheels on the forecourt stone, but not close enough to see who had arrived. She finished the section of border she was clearing, made her notes, and went inside to the kitchen entrance, as had become her habit, stopping to exchange a few words with Agnes about the rosemary she had transplanted to a sunnier position, and whether Agnes thought it would recover. She went upstairs to change out of her gardening dress. She came down 30 minutes later to find Mrs. Doran waiting at the bottom of the staircase with an expression the housekeeper had not worn before, not alarmed precisely, but calibrated in the careful way of someone managing several difficult things simultaneously. "Miss Ashwood," Mrs. Doran said, "His Grace asks that you join him in the drawing-room." "Of course." Elara read the housekeeper's face. "What has happened?" "Lord Ashmore is visiting," Mrs. Doran said, which was an answer and also not one. The drawing-room was the largest and most formal room on the ground floor, used for guests of sufficient standing, and on occasions that required the performance of a hospitality the castle did not naturally emit. Elara had been in it twice since her arrival, once during the household tour, and once to assess the condition of the curtains, which needed replacing, and which she had added to the long quiet list she was compiling of things Ravensmore needed. Both times the room had been empty. Now, as she approached, she could hear voices. The Duke's low, contained cadences, and another voice, louder, looser, with the carrying quality of a man who has never needed to wonder if he would be heard. She opened the door. 2 things happened simultaneously. Lord Ashmore turned from the window, where he had been standing with a glass of the Duke's brandy, and looked at her with the polite, assessing expression of a man meeting someone new. And then the expression changed. Not dramatically. Lord Ashmore was not a man who did anything dramatically, she suspected. It changed in the small, precise ways that a face changes when the information it is receiving does not match the information it expected. A fractional pause. A sharpening behind the eyes. The Duke was watching him. Elara understood, in the space between one breath and the next, what was happening. She did not let it reach her face. "Lord Ashmore," she said, moving into the room with the composure she had been cultivating since the age of 12 in a household that rewarded it. "I understand you are an old acquaintance of the estate. I am glad to meet you." "And you," Lord Ashmore said, with a smile that was warm on the surface and working underneath. He took her hand, briefly. "Though I confess, I had expected to be meeting someone else. I was present, you see, at the Ashwood family's autumn reception last year. I was acquainted with Miss Cecily Ashwood." A pause, perfectly weighted. "You are not Miss Cecily Ashwood." The room was very quiet. "No," Ilara said. "I am not." "Ilara Ashwood," he said as though placing her. And she understood from his tone that he was placing her, that he had seen her at that same reception, unremarked upon as she always was at gatherings where Cecily was present, a secondary figure in her sister's peripheral vision. The younger sister. The elder, in fact, she said pleasantly. A common mistake. Lord Ashmore turned to look at the Duke with an expression that was almost sympathetic in the way that a man looks sympathetic when he is also, privately, extremely interested. "Kaelin," he said. "I see." "Do you?" the Duke said. His voice was entirely even. It was, Ilara had learned, at its most dangerous when it was entirely even. "Your bride," Lord Ashmore said, "is not the woman your contract named." "My bride," the Duke said, with a deliberateness that Ilara felt in her sternum, "is an Ashwood, as the contract named." It was the first time he had called her his bride. Not Miss Ashwood, not a circumspect reference to the arrangement. His bride. She kept her face composed and her breathing steady. Lord Ashmore was quiet for a moment, turning his brandy glass slowly in one hand. He was a kind of man, Ilara assessed, who had not arrived at 50 without understanding when a situation required careful handling. But he was also the kind of man who had not arrived at 50 without a significant appreciation for information that could be useful later. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and she trusted neither. "Well," he said finally, with the expansive good humor of someone choosing, for now, to be gracious. "The Ashwood name is the Ashwood name. I expect you are right." He smiled at Ilara. Forgive an old man his surprise. "I simply remembered Cecily rather vividly." "Most people do," Ilara said. "She is very beautiful." "She is," he agreed. "And where is she now?" "Happily settled," Ilara said. "I will pass along your regards." It was a clean deflection, and they both knew it, and Lord Ashmore accepted it with the grace of a man who had gathered what he came for and was content to leave the rest for another occasion. The conversation moved to other things, estate business, county matters, a parliamentary issue that Lord Ashmore and the Duke had some shared stake in. Ilara sat and listened and spoke when spoken to and gave nothing further away. Lord Ashmore left 2 hours later. She stood at the drawing-room window and watched his carriage move down the drive, and she counted her own heartbeats until it passed through the gates, and then she let out a breath that had been waiting some considerable time to be released. "Miss Ashwood." She turned. The Duke was still in the room. She had thought he had followed Lord Ashmore out, but he had not. He was standing near the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, watching her with that direct, unreadable regard. "You handled that with considerable composure," he said. "I have had practice," she said, "at being overlooked in rooms where my sister was present. It teaches you to be very quiet and very watchful. Those are useful skills in other circumstances." He was silent for a moment. "Then, he will talk." "Yes," she said. "He will. The county will know by the end of the week that the woman I married is not the woman the contract originally named." "Probably sooner," she said. He struck me as efficient. Something that might, in a different face, have constituted a very dry, almost smile, moved briefly across the Duke's expression. "It will raise questions," he said, "about your father's conduct, about the legitimacy of the arrangement. There are people with an interest in destabilizing this estate who will use it." "I know," she said. "I am sorry. This is my father's doing, not yours, and the consequences have arrived at your door." "They have arrived at our door," he said, with a precision that stopped her. He held her gaze. "You are part of this household, Miss Ashwood. The consequences are shared." She looked at him. This severe and careful man, who stood in firelight with his hands clasped behind his back and his scarred face offering nothing easily, who had set our door without apparently deciding to, the way truths sometimes emerge before they have been approved. "Our door," she repeated quietly. He did not confirm it again. He did not need to. He moved toward the entrance of the room and then stopped, and without turning fully toward her, he said, "We will need to discuss the full account of the substitution, formally, so that my solicitors have an accurate record." A pause. Tomorrow morning, if you are willing." "I am willing," she said. He left. Alara remained by the window a little longer, the afternoon light coming gray and level through the glass, the gate at the end of the drive standing open in Lord Ashmore's wake like a mouth that had just said something that could not be taken back. She thought about the word "are" and what it cost a man like Caelan Ravensmore to say it. She thought it had cost him something. She thought he had said it anyway. Outside, the raven on the gate crest caught the last of the flat afternoon light, its stone wings perpetually mid-flight, perpetually suspended between the leaving and the staying. She understood, she thought, something of how that felt. She did not sleep well the night before the meeting with the solicitors. This was not, she told herself, because she was afraid. She had made a reasonable peace with fear over the years, had learned to sit with it the way you sit with difficult weather, acknowledging its presence without allowing it to determine your movements. What kept her awake was something more precise than fear. It was the particular alertness of someone who understands that the next day will require the best version of themselves, and who cannot entirely trust that the best version will arrive on time. She rose before the household and went to the garden in the thin, early light, because the garden had become the place where she found herself most reliably, and she walked the paths between the old plantings in the salt cold air and listened to the sea below the cliffs, and let the morning do what mornings do, which is to say, make the night's anxieties appear slightly smaller and more manageable than they had seemed at 2 in the morning. By the time she came in, washed and dressed, she was steady. The meeting was held in the Duke's study, the same room where she had stood on her first evening at Ravensmore and told him the truth abbreviated. The solicitor, a precise and elderly man named Mr. Graves, who had traveled from the nearest town, and appeared to regard the entire situation with the detached professionalism of someone who had processed many varieties of human difficulty and was not easily surprised, sat at one side of the desk with his documents arranged before him. The Duke sat at the other. Alara sat across from them both, folded her hands in her lap, and gave her account. She was thorough. She had always had a good memory, one of those minds that retains detail without effort, that can reconstruct a conversation or a sequence of events with the fidelity of a document. She told Mr. Graves about her father's debts, about the contract, about the elopement, about the hour in the candlelight and the carriage at dawn. She told it plainly, without embellishment or self-exculpation, and when Mr. Graves asked questions, she answered them directly. Through all of it, the Duke sat with his hands flat on the desk and said nothing. When Mr. Graves had finished and gathered his papers and made his measured way out of the study, the door closing behind him with a soft finality, Alara remained in her chair and waited. The Duke looked at the documents in front of him for a moment. Then he rose and went to the window, the same window she had seen him stand at on that first night, looking out at the fog. The fog was not present this morning. The day was clear and cold, and the sea was visible from where she sat, a hard, bright line against the sky. "Your father knowingly deceived me," he said. Yes. He believed the distance, and the contract's wording would make the deception effectively permanent. "I believe so." He did not consider, the Duke said, "that you might be honest with me." Alara was quiet for a moment. "I think he considered it unlikely that I would be given the opportunity to be honest with you. He expected you to receive a substitute and accept her without examination. He expected me to be indifferent to who I had married. He expected you to be indifferent to who I was," she said, with a precision she had not entirely planned. "Which is a different thing. He has always found it easy to be indifferent to who I am." The Duke turned from the window then and looked at her, and there was something in his expression she had not seen before, a focus, a directness, as though something she had said had resolved an equation he had been working on. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to answer it with the same honesty you have applied to everything else." "Of course." He came back to the desk, but he did not sit. He stood at its edge, closer than he usually placed himself, and looked at her with those gray eyes that had nothing in common with indifference. "When you came here," he said, "you told me you had no meaningful alternative. That you came because you were given no choice." A pause. "That remains true. I am not disputing it. But I want to know, Now, after these weeks, whether you would still choose to leave if leaving were made available to you. The room was very still. It was, she understood, the question beneath all the other questions. The one that the solicitor's presence and the contract's language and the county's gossip had been circling without ever reaching. It was the question he had not asked on the first morning, when he had given her his decision to proceed in a single word delivered through Mrs. Doran. He was asking it now, in the clear morning light, without the protection of procedural distance. She looked at him steadily. "When I arrived here," she said, "I told you I was not afraid of this house. I said it for reasons I could not yet name." She paused. "I can name them now. I said it because I could see, even then, that this house was full of something that had not been allowed to finish. Something that had been stopped before it could resolve." She looked at the window, at the hard bright line of sea beyond it. "I am not a person who walks away from unfinished things. It is perhaps my most impractical quality." The Duke was quiet. "I would not choose to leave," she said. "That is my honest answer." He absorbed this the way he absorbed most things she said, without immediate, visible response, taking it somewhere internal where she could not follow. He looked at the desk for a moment, and then he pulled out the chair across from hers and sat down, and the formality of the morning's configuration shifted into something less structured. "My solicitors will be pursuing action against your father," he said. "The deception is legally actionable. I want you to know this not to distress you, but because you may receive correspondence from him, and I want you to be prepared." "I expected it," she said, "and I am not distressed. My relationship with my father has been a formal one for many years. This will not change its character significantly. If he attempts to contact you in a way that is unwelcome," the Duke said, "you will tell me." It was not a question. It was not quite a command. It occupied the space between them, a space that had been, she thought, quietly shrinking since the storm in the library, since the soup from Agnes's kitchen, since our door. "I will tell you," she said. He nodded. Then, in a tone that was still careful, but had lost some of its formal scaffolding, "You said the garden has good bones." The shift surprised her, not unpleasantly. "Yes. My mother used that phrase," he said, "about Ravensmoor, when I was a child and complained that it was too cold and too far from everything and too full of wind." The ghost of something moved across his face. "She said it has good bones. Everything else is merely weather." Ilara felt something move in her chest, quiet and warm and not entirely expected. "She sounds like someone worth knowing." She was. He said it simply and without the armored brevity he applied to most personal disclosures. Just, she was. "She died when I was 19. She would have found you interesting." Would she? She valued directness. He met Ilara's eyes. She had very little patience for performance. "We would have understood each other," Ilara said. Something shifted in the Duke's expression then. Not the almost smile she had catalogued before, not the brief fractional movement of someone suppressing a response. This was quieter than that. A softening around the eyes, barely visible. The kind of change that happens when something reaches a person beneath the level of their defenses. He stood, signaling the conversation's end. She stood as well. At the door, she paused. "Your Grace," she said. He looked at her. "I think you are not as indifferent as you have decided to be," she said. "I think indifference is something you have worked very hard to construct, and I think it has cost you considerably more than it has saved you." She said it without challenge, without heat, in the same tone she would use to note that a plant needed more water or a window needed resealing. A simple observation, offered and left. She did not wait for his response. She went out into the corridor and along the passage toward the garden stairs, and behind her she heard nothing. No reply, no movement, no closing door. Just silence. But it was, she had learned, a particular kind of silence. The kind that comes after something true has been said and has not been denied. She had learned to tell the difference. It was a dog that did it. Not a grand gesture, not a moment of orchestrated revelation, not the kind of dramatic pivot that announces itself with swelling strings and perfect lighting. It was a dog, a young hound of no particular dignity named Copernicus, who belonged technically to the estate and practically to no one, who had arrived as a puppy the previous spring as a gift from a neighboring landowner, and had since distinguished himself primarily by his catastrophic relationship with his own feet. Elara had made Copernicus's acquaintance in her first week at Ravensmoor, when he had appeared in the walled garden with an expression of profound optimism, and immediately tripped over a raised stone edging, and sat down hard in a patch of late flowering thyme, looking up at her with the serene, unbothered dignity of a creature who has decided that embarrassment is a concept that applies to other people. She had loved him immediately. He had taken to following her on her morning rounds of the garden, trotting at her heels with the earnest enthusiasm of someone who is not entirely sure what the agenda is, but is fully committed to participating in it. He was not graceful. He was not, if she was honest, particularly intelligent. But he was present in the wholehearted way of animals who have not learned to hold any part of themselves in reserve, and in a house that held so much in reserve, she found this enormously refreshing. It was a Friday morning, clear and cold with the particular crystalline quality of late autumn on the northern coast, when it happened. Elara was crossing the inner courtyard, the enclosed space between the main building and the old chapel that was used primarily as a thoroughfare, flagged in old stone with a stone bench along one side where someone had once placed a row of terracotta pots, now empty. She was carrying her journal and a cutting she had taken from the climbing rose on the south wall, intending to try rooting it in the kitchen garden, and she was thinking about soil drainage and not about much else. Copernicus was accompanying her. He was, as he often was, slightly behind her and slightly to the left, which was his preferred position, close enough to feel part of whatever was happening, far enough to maintain the theoretical option of independent agency. He was trotting with his usual optimistic incompetence, his large paws finding the gaps between flagstones with reliable inaccuracy, when he encountered the step. It was a single stone step, the modest rise between the lower courtyard level and the flagged path to the chapel door. Copernicus had navigated the step, by Elara's count, approximately 40 times since she had known him. He was aware of the step. He had prior experience of the step. He tripped over it anyway. Not a small trip, a committed one. His front legs went forward, his back legs went sideways. He performed a movement that managed to be both undignified and oddly aerodynamic. And then he sat down on the far side of the step with an expression of complete philosophical acceptance, as though this outcome had been predicted and was simply the universe confirming itself. Elara laughed. It came out before she could consider it, unguarded and genuine. The kind of laugh that lives below the level of social management, that doesn't ask permission before it arrives. It was not a polite sound. It was full and unself-conscious, and it startled a pair of jackdaws off the chapel roof and sent them wheeling up into the clear, cold sky, and it lasted longer than was perhaps strictly proportionate to the event that had caused it. She recovered herself, crossed to Copernicus, crouched to check that he had sustained no damage beyond his dignity. He had not. And straightened up, still smiling. And then she became aware that she was being watched. The Duke was standing at the far end of the courtyard. She did not know how long he had been there. He was in his outdoor coat, clearly on his way somewhere, and he had stopped in the arched entrance to the courtyard, and he was looking at her. Not with the careful neutral assessment she had become accustomed to. Not with the contained consideration he applied to most things she said and did. He was smiling. Not a social smile, not the managed performance of pleasantness that people of his rank deploy at necessary functions. A real one, involuntary and unguarded, and lighting the severe architecture of his face with something she had not yet seen there and could not, in this first moment of seeing it, fully process. It reached his eyes. It changed everything about him. The way light changes a landscape it suddenly falls on, revealing the topography that shadow had been keeping private. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then he became aware that she had seen it, and it faded, not harshly, not slammed shut the way she might have expected, but receding gradually, like a tide going out, leaving behind it something different from what had been there before. He did not look cold. He looked like a man who had been somewhere briefly that he had not expected to go. From the doorway behind him, Elara heard a sound. She glanced past the Duke's shoulder and saw Mrs. Doran standing in the interior corridor beyond the arch, a set of household ledgers in her arms, quite still. The housekeeper's face was doing something extraordinary. The careful professional composure that Alara had come to regard as essentially permanent was fractured, just slightly, around the eyes. They were bright. Unusually, unmistakably bright. Mrs. Doran met Alara's gaze across the courtyard. Then the housekeeper looked at the Duke's profile and back at Alara, and something passed between them, woman to woman, across the flagstones and the clear autumn air, that had nothing to do with household management or social convention, or any of the formal structures that governed life in this castle. Then Mrs. Doran turned quietly and went back the way she had come. Alara looked at the Duke. Copernicus, she said, because something needed to be said, and his name seemed the safest beginning, has a complicated relationship with that particular step. I have observed this, the Duke said. His voice was not entirely its usual self. There was something in it that had not fully returned to its habitual precision. He has also in the past month fallen into the ornamental fountain, become stuck behind the library door, and knocked an entire tray of seedlings from the kitchen windowsill. He has great enthusiasm, Alara said. He has, the Duke agreed, a complete absence of spatial awareness. I find it endearing. I know, he said. I have seen you defend his intelligence to Agnes on 3 separate occasions. She looked at him. You have been paying attention. It was not an accusation. It was an observation, offered with the same directness she applied to everything, and it landed between them with a weight that both of them felt and neither immediately addressed. The Duke looked at Copernicus, who was now investigating something between 2 flagstones with intense interest and great positional instability. He was given to the estate as a hunting dog, the Duke said. His prospects in that role are not strong. No, she agreed. But he would be an excellent companion for someone who required one. A pause. He has appointed himself yours, the Duke said. He follows you. He follows anyone who will have him. He followed me once, the Duke said, with a dryness so understated she almost missed it. For approximately 10 minutes. Then he found something more interesting in a hedge, and I lost him. Alara laughed again, smaller this time, but genuine. And this time she was watching the Duke's face when she laughed. And she saw the thing happen again, not as fully as before, not the complete, unguarded opening of that first smile, but the echo of it. A warmth at the corner of his eyes. A slight yielding in the set of his mouth. She thought of Mrs. Doran, turning quietly back the way she had come, her eyes bright. She thought of what it meant that someone weeping at the sight of this man smiling was an appropriate response. What it said about the length of his absence from that simple human expression. What it said about what the years since his first wife's death had taken from him. What it said about how long this house had been waiting for someone to make him smile. She did not say any of this. She bent and collected her dropped cutting from the flagstones, checked it was undamaged, and tucked it back under her arm. I should get this to the kitchen garden, she said, before the morning gets any further. Of course, he said. She began to move past him toward the arch, and as she passed him, close enough in the narrow space that she could see the texture of the old stone above his shoulder, he said quietly, without looking at her, Alara. She stopped. It was the first time he had used her given name. Not Miss Ashwood, not the careful formal address he had maintained since her arrival, but Alara, her actual name, in his low, precise voice, in the clear, cold air of the courtyard with Copernicus snuffling between the flagstones behind them. She waited very still. The garden, he said, after a moment. What you said about it needing someone to pay it attention without imposing too much order. A pause. You were right. He moved past her into the courtyard and across toward the chapel path, and she stood in the arch and watched him go, and Copernicus abandoned his investigation of the flagstones and trotted after the Duke for approximately 20 feet before discovering something in a crack in the wall that required immediate and total commitment. Alara stood in the arch for a moment longer. The jackdaws had returned to the chapel roof. The sea was audible below the cliffs, its steady, patient working. The climbing rose on the south wall had gone to its late autumn red, the last of the season's color, brilliant against the dark stone. She looked at all of it, the courtyard, the chapel, the rose, the sky, and she felt, moving through her chest with the quiet certainty of something that has been true for some time and has finally decided to announce itself. The specific warmth of a heart that is in the process of committing to something it cannot yet fully name. She walked on toward the kitchen garden. She did not try to name it yet, but she stopped trying to pretend she did not feel it. The key was on his desk for 3 days before he said anything about it. Alara noticed it on the first morning. A large iron key, old, with a particular darkened patina of something that has been handled often over many years and not handled at all for a long time since. It lay apart from the estate documents and correspondence, placed with the deliberateness of something set down in a specific location after consideration, not simply left. She did not ask about it. She had learned the rhythms of this man well enough by now to understand that there were things he needed to approach in his own time, and that inquiry, however gently offered, could close a door that silence would eventually open. She waited. On the second day, the key was still there. On the third day, which was a Sunday, quiet throughout the castle in the particular way of Sundays in large houses, the staff reduced to essential duties, the usual industrial sounds of a working household stilled. She came to the study after breakfast to return a book she had borrowed from the shelves within, and found the Duke standing at the desk, looking at the key. Not reaching for it, not picking it up, simply looking at it, with the expression of a man engaged in a conversation with himself that had been going on for some time, and had not yet reached a conclusion. He looked up when she entered. "Miss Ashwood," he said, and then, correcting himself, with a slight adjustment she had begun to hear in his voice, when he caught himself using the formal address, Alara. "Good morning," she said. She placed the book on the shelf and would have left, giving him the privacy the moment seemed to require. But something in his stillness stopped her. Not a request. He was not a man who made requests easily, but a quality of stillness that was different from his usual self-containment. Heavier. The stillness of someone standing at the edge of something. "Sit down," he said. "If you have a moment." She sat. He remained standing for a while, looking at the key, and she waited without filling the silence. Outside, the Sunday sea moved against the cliffs in its slow, unceasing way, and a gull called once, and then was quiet, and the fire in the grate breathed steadily in the absence of other sound. Her name, the Duke said at last, was Margaret. Alara did not move. Margaret Voss, before she was Margaret Ravensmore. He said it in the careful tone of someone handling something that must be handled carefully. The way you lift a thing that has been still for a long time, not knowing what you will disturb beneath it. She was 21 when we married. I was 26. The arrangement was made by our families in the way these arrangements are made, with practical consideration and the mutual convenience of two estates with adjacent interests. He paused. She was not happy here, he said. 3 words that landed with enormous weight, as simply delivered as the 3 words Mrs. Doran had spoken on that first morning. "Cecily is gone." Alara understood that the simplicity was not indifference, but its opposite, that these words had been carried for so long, and with such difficulty that by now they had been worn smooth, and what remained was the essential, irreducible fact of them. "She tried," he said. "I want to be accurate about this. She was not unkind, and she was not dishonest. She tried to make a life here, and Ravensmore, I did not make it easy." He moved from the desk to the window, and she noticed that he placed himself there often when he said difficult things, as though the view of the sea steadied him. "I was not as I am now. I was younger, and I had not yet learned that distance is not the same as strength. I kept her at a remove. I told myself it was temperament. It was cowardice." Alara was quiet. She understood, with a precision that moved through her carefully, that what he was telling her was not simply his first wife's story. It was his own accounting, delivered in the sober and unsparing tone of a man who has had 3 years in a castle full of silences to examine his own record and has not permitted himself to falsify it. She had a friend, he said, a man she had known before the marriage. There was nothing improper between them. I want to be clear about this, because there were people who said otherwise, and they were wrong. He was a friend. He wrote to her. She wrote to him. It was the correspondence of someone who was lonely, and had found the one connection that still made her feel known. A pause. I found the letters. I did not read them. I want to be clear about that too. But I found them, and I was not angry. Angry is not the right word. I was ashamed, because I understood in the moment of finding them what their existence meant. It meant that my wife had needed to reach outside our marriage for the simple comfort of feeling understood by another person, and that this was not her failure. He stopped. Elara waited. She died in the second winter, he said. A fever. It came quickly, and it did not relent, and she was gone in 9 days. He said this with the flatness of a grief that has been visited so many times it has lost the capacity to surprise, but none of its weight. There was nothing mysterious about it. There was nothing I could have prevented by different action in those 9 days. But I have spent 3 years understanding that the life she lived in the years before those 9 days, the loneliness of it, the quiet and persistent loneliness of it, was something I could have prevented. He turned from the window. He picked up the key from the desk. He looked at it for a moment in his hand, and then he looked at Elara, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, not raw, not undone, but open the way of a man who has made a decision and has passed the point where the decision can be unmade. Come with me, he said. They went up to the 3rd floor. The eastern corridor was dim and smelled of disuse. Not unpleasant, simply the particular stillness of a space that had been sealed away from the regular passage of air and people. He walked ahead of her without speaking, his footsteps quiet on the stone, and she followed, and Copernicus, who had been sleeping at the top of the main staircase with the thoroughness he applied to all activities, raised his head as they passed, and then lowered it again with supreme indifference to events above his immediate interest. The door at the end of the corridor was the one she had seen from below on her first week, the one beneath which she had imagined the thread of candlelight. Up close it was an ordinary door, old oak iron handle, nothing remarkable about it except the quality of the silence on the other side of it. The Duke put the key in the lock. The door opened. The room inside was not what she had imagined. She had not fully acknowledged to herself that she had imagined it, but she had. And she had imagined something that matched the Gothic weight the house occasionally tried to press upon her. Darkness, disorder, the theatrical wreckage of grief. What she found instead was a room that had been cared for. A sitting room modestly sized, with a writing desk at the window and a chair beside the fireplace and bookshelves along one wall. Someone came here still. The fireplace held the evidence of recent use, and the desk was clean. Not preserved in amber, like Miss Havisham's table, but maintained. Quietly, privately maintained. On the writing desk was a small stack of letters, tied with ribbon. On the bookshelves between books, small objects were interspersed, a pressed flower in a frame, a small painted miniature, a pair of gloves folded neatly. Personal things. The kind of things that constitute a person's texture, that don't survive in official portraits or legal documents, but persist stubbornly in the small evidence of daily life. On the wall above the fireplace was the portrait. Not turned to face the wall, this one, the portrait she had not seen, hung in its proper orientation, and she looked at it and understood immediately why it was here and not in the public rooms of the house. It was not a formal portrait. It was a kind of painting commissioned by someone who wanted to capture a person rather than a position. A young woman sitting sideways in a chair, turned partly toward the window, with an expression of thoughtful preoccupation that the painter had caught with great skill. She was not looking at the viewer. She was looking at something outside the frame, and she was, Elara thought, beautiful in the specific way of someone who is beautiful without being fully aware of it. She was also, clearly, not entirely happy. It was not in her face exactly. The painter had not been cruel, but it was in her posture, in the slight inward quality of someone who has gotten into the habit of keeping the most important part of themselves very quiet. Elara looked at the portrait for a long time. Then she looked at the Duke, who was standing just inside the doorway, not moving further into the room, watching her with a careful vigilance that she understood now was not about her judgment of this space, but about his own. "You come here," she said quietly. Not an accusation. A recognition. "Yes," he said. "To remember her. To be accountable to her," he said. "There is a difference." He paused. "I cannot change what the marriage was. But I can refuse to pretend it was something else. I can refuse to erase her. Elara looked at the portrait once more. At the young woman looking out the window at something she hadn't been able to reach. Then she crossed the room, past the writing desk, past the small personal objects on the shelves, and she stood before the portrait and she thought about loneliness that reaches outside itself through letters to feel known. She thought about a garden designed by a woman who hoped a book about coastal plants might make her husband look out his own window. She turned to face the Duke. She would not want you to keep carrying it the way you have been, she said. The blame. The sentence of it. She said it steadily, with the careful certainty of someone who has listened long enough to earn the right to speak. Grief is appropriate. Accountability is appropriate. But you have gone past accountability into something that is only punishing you. And whatever she would have wanted, a woman who tried, as you said, who was not unkind, who looked out windows, I do not believe she would have wanted that. The Duke stood in the doorway. He said nothing for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual, and something in it was different, not broken, not undone, but changed in the way of something that has been held under pressure for a very long time and has finally, carefully, been allowed to release. I have not, he said, allowed anyone in this room before. I know, she said gently. I am not certain why he stopped. You don't have to be certain, she said. Not yet. He looked at her across the quiet room, across the writing desk and the pressed flower and the letters tied with ribbon, across all the careful evidence of a grief that had been tended with more love than it had perhaps been given the right to expect. And his expression held something she had not seen in it before. Not the warmth of the courtyard smile, not the careful assessment of the study, but something deeper and more unguarded than either. The expression of a man standing in a place of great personal cost, with another person present, and finding that the presence is not unbearable. Finding, perhaps, that it is something else entirely. Her garden, he said at last. The walled garden. Elara waited. It was hers, he said. She designed it. The same way my mother designed it before her. She spent her first summer here planning it, and she never saw the second planting. He looked at the window. When you said it had good bones, when you said it had been lonely. He stopped again. I will take care of it, Elara said quietly. If you will let me. He did not answer immediately. He looked at the portrait once more, and she thought she saw something pass between him and the painted face of the woman in the chair. Not words, not the supernatural, but the simple human act of a person reaching the end of something they have been carrying for a very long time. Then he looked at Elara. Yes, he said. One word. But she heard everything in it that he had not yet learned to say. And she thought that for now, for today, in this quiet room on the third floor with the sea beyond the window and the portrait on the wall, and 3 years of careful, costly silence finally beginning to move, that one word was more than enough. The letter from her father arrived on a Wednesday. Elara recognized the handwriting on the seal before she had fully registered what she was looking at, that particular forward-leaning script. Each letter precisely formed in the manner of a man who had taught himself to write as an adult and had never entirely lost the effortfulness of it. She was in the morning room when Mrs. Doran brought it, and she set down her tea and looked at it for a moment in the way you look at something you have been expecting and are not entirely prepared for now that it has arrived. She broke the seal and read it. It was shorter than she had anticipated. Her father was not, when it came to written communication, a man inclined to brevity. She had received letters from him over the years that managed to occupy 3 pages without saying anything that could not have been said in 3 sentences. This letter was different. It was 2 paragraphs, and it was, in its way, a portrait of a man who had received news from a solicitor and understood the precise dimensions of his situation. The first paragraph detailed his position. The Duke's legal action was, he understood, proceeding. He had taken advice. He was prepared to settle the matter without public proceedings, providing the financial terms were reasonable. He wished it to be known that his actions had been motivated by the welfare of his family. Elara noted this phrase with the detachment of someone reading a document about a person they once knew, and that he had acted within the letter, if not the spirit, of the contract. The second paragraph was 4 sentences. He hoped she was well. He hoped the Duke treated her with appropriate respect. He understood that she was now settled in her position. He did not anticipate that their correspondence would need to be frequent. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases, set it on the table beside her cooling tea, and looked out the window at the walled garden, where the late November light was falling clean and level across the old plantings she had been tending for 2 months now. The beds turned and mulched for winter. The climbing rose cut back and secured against the coming cold. She felt not grief, not anger, something quieter and more final than either. The sensation of a door closing on a room she had never been fully welcome in, swinging shut with the gentle inevitability of something that has been ajar for too long. She thought about the second paragraph. 4 sentences. I do not anticipate that our correspondence will need to be frequent. She picked up her journal and wrote, he has finally said something honest. Then she closed the journal and went to find the Duke. He was in the study, as he usually was in the mornings. The estate business of a property the size of Ravensmoor generated a steady and apparently inexhaustible supply of correspondence and decisions, and he moved through it with the same methodical precision he applied to everything. She knocked. He called her in, and she entered, and she set the letter on the desk in front of him. From your father, he said, reading the handwriting. Yes. I thought you should see it, given that your solicitors are involved. He read it. She watched his face as he did, the slight tightening at the first paragraph, the stillness of the second. When he finished, he set it down and looked at her. Are you all right? He said. It was the first time he had asked her that. Not the implicit inquiry of small practical considerations. Are you warm enough? Is the room sufficient? Does the library have what you need? But the direct question, are you all right? Asked with his eyes steady on her face and a quality of attention that was entirely personal. Yes, she said. And then, because he had shown her the 3rd floor and she owed him honesty of equivalent weight, it is like reading a document about someone else's father. I stopped expecting warmth from him a long time ago. But seeing the absence of it stated so plainly in his own hand, that is a different experience from simply knowing it. The Duke was quiet for a moment. He does not deserve the space you have given him in your understanding, he said. You have been more generous in your interpretation of his motives than he has earned. Probably, she said. It is a habit I am working on. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, with the careful deliberateness of someone who has made a decision before the conversation and is now acting on it. Sit down. There is something I need to tell you. She sat. He rose from behind the desk and moved to the window, his habitual position for difficult things, and stood looking out at the grounds while he assembled his words with the precision of a man who understands that some things cannot be revised. Once said, I have written to my solicitors, he said, not only about the action against your father. A pause. I have instructed them to draw up new papers. The settlement your father received when the contract was signed, I am transferring it to you, directly in your name, to be held in trust as your own independent means. Ilara was very still. You came here without choice, he said. You have stayed, and you have conducted yourself with more grace and intelligence and honesty than anyone I have known in this house, and you have done it without any material security beyond what the arrangement nominally provided. That is not acceptable to me. He turned from the window. Whatever happens between us, you will not be dependent on my continued goodwill for your material existence. That is not a foundation on which anything honest can be built. She looked at him, at the steady gray eyes and the scar and the severe and careful face of a man who had spent 3 years learning, in the hardest possible classroom, what it costs to let another person be lonely. Kalen, she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. The effect on him was subtle and total, a barely perceptible stillness, a quality of attention that sharpened and changed, the way a room changes when a window is opened in it. You did not have to do that, she said. I know, he said. That is precisely why I am doing it. She stood up, not toward the door, but toward him, across the study, past the desk and the morning's correspondence and the folded letter from her father, until she was standing at reasonable speaking distance from a man who was looking at her with an expression she was no longer attempting to decode and had decided simply to receive. I have been thinking, she said, about what it means to stay somewhere. Not because you have no alternative. Not because leaving is impractical. But because the place has become yours. Because you have put your hands in its soil and found its rhythms and learned the specific way the light falls in the late afternoon. And because there is a person in it whose margins are full of questions, and who called a horse gently by the stable, and who showed you the most private room in his house because he had decided, without fully deciding, to trust you. She paused. I am staying, she said, because I want to. I want that to be clear. The Duke, Kalen, looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the November wind moved across the headland, and the sea did its patient work below the cliffs. And somewhere in the castle Copernicus was almost certainly in the process of falling over something. And the walled garden that had been designed by two women who had loved this difficult, beautiful place was resting quietly under its winter mulch, waiting for spring. He crossed the distance between them. It was not a large distance. 3 steps, perhaps 4. But she understood, watching him cross it, that it was the largest distance he had crossed in 3 years, and that he had crossed it deliberately, with full knowledge of what it meant. He took her hand, not as a gesture of formal courtesy, not the brief social contact of a gloved introduction, but her hand, held in both of his, with a care that was more articulate than any speech she had heard from him. I have been building a case against feeling anything, he said quietly, for a considerable time. I had very good reasons. I had constructed very sound arguments. He looked at their joined hands. You have dismantled them with exceptional efficiency. I did not intend to, she said, though this was not entirely true. I know. The corner of his mouth moved. That is what made it so effective. She laughed, and he smiled, and this time she was close enough to see it fully, the way you can only fully see something when you are standing directly in its light. It was the courtyard smile, the unguarded one, but longer this time and warmer, settling into the lines of his face, as though it had always known where it belonged, and had simply been waiting for permission. She thought of Mrs. Doran's bright eyes. She thought he would need to smile more, so that people could stop being surprised by it. I should tell you something, he said, and his voice was lower now, stripped of its remaining formality, the voice of a man rather than a duke. I told myself when I decided that the arrangement would proceed that first morning, I told myself it was the practical decision, the legal and financial logic. I was very convincing. A pause. I do not think it was the practical decision. No, she said. I think, he said, that you told me you were not afraid of this house, and I had not heard anyone say that before, and I wanted to understand why you were not afraid. He looked at her with a directness that had nothing measured or careful left in it. I wanted to know you. The fire in the grate. The sea beyond the windows. The castle settling around them in its old stones, its long memory, its collection of griefs and silences now, in this moment, being asked to make room for something else. You know me now, she said softly. I am beginning to, he said. I should like to continue. She looked up at him. This man who had smiled for the first time in years at a dog falling over a step, who kept questions in his margins because conclusions foreclosed, who had carried guilt like ballast, and who was, she thought, the most honest person she had met, in the way that people are honest, when they have been through enough to understand that pretense is simply too expensive. Then continue, she said. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to it, not the perfunctory social kiss, but something slower and more deliberate, an acknowledgement that carried within it everything he had not yet found the words for, and was not rushing to find, because some things are better understood than named. When he lifted his head, his eyes were warm in a way she had not seen before, a warmth that went all the way down, that had nothing held back from it. There are things I should say, he said, that I have not yet said. There is time, she said. Yes, he said, and the word was simple and certain and full of a future he had stopped believing in and was now, carefully, beginning to believe in again. There is. Outside, the winter light moved across the headland. The sea continued. The raven on the gate crest held its perpetual position, wings open, suspended between departure and arrival, and the castle that had been silent for so long held its breath for a moment. And then, like a house that has remembered what it is for, exhaled. Spring came to Ravensmoor the way it always had, gradually, Then suddenly, first the light changed. The particular quality of northern winter light, which has a flat and final quality to it, like a sentence that has ended without resolution, began to soften in late February, arriving at new angles through the castle windows, falling on stone floors and worn rugs and the spines of annotated books in ways that winter had not permitted. Then the wind off the sea shifted its register, losing its hard edge, carrying with it the faint brine and green smell of a world remembering how to grow. Then the garden. Alara was in the walled garden on the morning the first crocus came through. She almost missed it. It was small, a pale purple thing pushing up through the mulch she had laid in November, with the serene indifference of something that has been doing this for a very long time and does not require acknowledgement to continue. She saw it because she was looking, as she always was looking, with the careful habitual attention that had been her nature long before Ravensmoor and had found in this garden its fullest and most satisfying application. She crouched down beside it for a long moment. Then she went inside and up to the study and opened the door without knocking, which he had stopped doing in January, and said, "Come and see something." Callan looked up from his correspondence. He read her face. He had become very good at reading her face, with a focused application of a man who has discovered that this is among the most rewarding texts he has encountered. And he set down his pen. He came. They stood together in the walled garden, the March air cool and salt-edged around them, and looked at the small pale crocus pushing through the dark earth, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because it did not require anything said. Then Callan looked at the garden around it, at the beds Alara had turned and tended and planned over the winter months, at the climbing rows cut back and waiting, at the new plantings she had put in along the south wall that would bloom in June. He looked at it with the expression she had first seen in the anteroom doorway, when he showed her the third floor, open, unguarded, the expression of a man allowing himself to see something fully. "My mother would have liked you enormously," he said. "You have said that before," she said. "It continues to be true," he said. She smiled, and he watched her smile. He had made a study of her smile over the winter months, in a way that a person makes a study of something they have come to regard as genuinely important, cataloging its variations, learning the difference between the smile she gave Agnes when accepting shortbread and the one she gave Copernicus when he did something catastrophic, and the one, rarer and quieter, that appeared when she was reading something that moved her and did not know she was being observed. That last one was his favorite. He had told her so one evening in the library, in a moment of uncharacteristic directness that had surprised them both. She had looked up from her book and looked at him for a long moment. And then she had said, "You have been studying me," and he had said, without hesitation, "Yes," and the ease of that admission had surprised him more than anything else. The discovery that honesty offered to the right person does not cost what you expect it to cost. That it returns something. The castle had changed over the winter. It had changed in the small ways first. Flowers in the entrance hall. Alara had simply put them there one morning, and nobody had removed them. And then they had been replaced when they faded, and replaced again, until flowers in the entrance hall became a fact of Ravensmoor rather than an exception to it. Books left open on side tables. Copernicus admitted to the library on winter evenings, sleeping on the hearth rug with his great paws extended and his nose tucked under his tail, occasionally emitting small sounds of dream contentment. Agnes producing shortbread at irregular intervals and leaving it in locations where it would be found by specific people she had decided deserved it. Mrs. Doran, who had kept this household running with devoted precision through 3 years of a master who had been present in body and largely elsewhere in spirit, had changed too, subtly, in the way of someone who has been waiting for a long time for a particular outcome and is now carefully allowing herself to believe in it. She smiled more. Not often and not extravagantly, because she was Mrs. Doran and extravagance was not in her nature. But more. The portrait had been moved from the 3rd floor, not to the public rooms. That had not seemed right, and Alara had not suggested it, and Callan had not proposed it. Instead it hung now in the private sitting room adjacent to the library, in a room that caught the afternoon light well, and that Alara had quietly furnished over the winter months into a room that was actually used, books on the table, a decent fire in the evenings, Copernicus on the rug. The portrait hung on the wall above the fireplace, and the young woman in it looked out her window at something outside the frame, and the room around her was warm and lived in, and Alara thought that this, of all the arrangements, was the one that felt most honest. Not erased, not enshrined, simply present as part of the house's full story, in a room where people sat and read and let the fire keep them. The key hung on a hook inside the third-floor door, which was no longer locked. The legal matter with her father had been settled in February, quietly, with the devastating efficiency of the Duke's solicitors and the cooperation of a man who understood when a situation had moved beyond his control. The financial terms had been, as Edmund Ashwood had requested, reasonable. Alara had not corresponded with him since his letter. She did not anticipate doing so frequently as he had suggested. She had found that she occupied the space his absence left with less difficulty than she might once have expected, because the space had been filled by other things. By a garden coming back to life. By a library full of questions. By the particular quality of an evening in a castle by the sea with a man who was learning, with her, how to let things be warm. She had written to Cecily. Cecily had written back, a long, breathless, Cecily-shaped letter, full of the particular energy of someone who has done something terrifying and correct simultaneously, and is still slightly giddy from both. She was happy. The younger Harcastle boy, his name was Edmund, which Alara found the universe's idea of a joke, was kind and attentive, and she had not once felt lonely. She asked about Ravensmoor with genuine curiosity and without guilt, because Cecily's relationship with guilt had always been efficient and brief. She asked about the Duke. Alara had written back, "He is not what the county thinks he is. He is considerably more." And she had described the garden and the library and the coastal flora book with its inscription, and the smile, and the morning they had stood together in the courtyard and looked at a dog perform his complicated negotiations with gravity, and she had not described all of it, because some things were hers. On a morning in late March, with the crocuses now joined by early daffodils, and the climbing rose putting out its first cautious new growth, Alara was sitting on the stone bench in the walled garden with her journal open on her knee, when Callan came and sat beside her. He did not always do this. He was still a man of deliberate movements, of chosen engagements, not given to the casual propinquity of people who have never learned to guard their own company. But he had been sitting beside her more often, lately, in the library, at dinner, on the bench in the garden, where his mother had once sat to plan the original planting, and where Margaret had sat, she imagined, in that first summer before the loneliness had settled in. He sat beside her, and he looked at the garden, and she looked at the garden, and the morning moved around them in its usual way. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what you said. In the study. That you were staying, because you wanted to." "Yes," she said. "I want to say something in return." He looked at the daffodils, at the new rose growth, at the garden that had come back from its long and unintended wilderness, with a patient inevitability of things that have good bones. "I want to say that I am glad you were sent here. Not glad of the manner of it. Your father's conduct was indefensible, and I remain of that opinion. But glad that you came through that door. Glad that you were not afraid of this house." He paused. "Glad that you stayed." Alara looked at him. At the profile she had come to know as well as she knew the garden's geography, the scar and the strong line of jaw, and the dark hair moving slightly in the sea wind. And she felt the thing in her chest that she had stopped trying to name, because it had become too large and too present to require a name. "I am glad too," she said. He turned to look at her. What passed between them in that moment was not spoken, but it was said, in the way that the most important things are often said, not in language, but in the full, unheld attention of one person looking at another, and allowing themselves to be seen in return. It was the look of two people who have arrived somewhere together without entirely planning the journey, and who recognize in the arriving that this is precisely where they were always going. He took her hand. The garden held them. The sea moved below, and Ravensmoor, old and storm-worn and full of its long history of silences, settled around them like a house that has finally, after a very long time, become a home. And in the warm and certain morning, with the daffodils in the beds that two women before her had planted and tended and loved, Alara Ashwood, who had been given 1 hour to become someone else, and had spent it deciding to remain entirely herself, understood that the life she had never thought to have had arrived not with fanfare or drama, but in the quiet, sturdy, enduring manner of something built to last. Like a garden with good bones. Like a castle on a cliff that has survived everything the sea has thrown at it and stands yet, its walls thick with history, and its windows lit against the dark. Like love that begins in unlikely circumstances and takes root anyway, because that is what love does when it finds ground willing to receive it. It grows,